Hello, friends. Welcome to the first episode of Uncommon Voices, Uncommon Visions. I'm Dr. Valerie Nyberg, and I'll be your host for today's podcast. Before we get started, since this is the first podcast, I feel the need to do some housekeeping. First, I wanted to introduce what Uncommon Voices and Uncommon Visions is. It's a bi-weekly podcast, which will be published Monday mornings. Often I'll have guests come on the podcast. These will be people who play various roles in education, especially people of color and women in leadership. Those are two demographics I think are important in terms of the uncommon voices and visions. The focus of our conversations will be varied based on the guest, but centered on the system of education, specific issues within teaching and learning, and the purpose will be to provide a voice and advocacy, share information and resources, solutions and problems of practice, and share stories and journeys in order to help create a community of educators. Right now, with the pandemic and everything that's going on in our country, it's so important to form a community that supports and sustains us through these troubling times, that we can lean to and go to find information, to be inspired. A little about me: my name is Dr. Valerie Nyberg. I have been a high school principal and associate principal. I am the 2019 School Administrators of Iowa Assistant Secondary Principal of the Year. I was the first Black female to be recognized in this capacity. I have hosted presentations and workshops for and with the School Administrators of Iowa, and I am also on their equity team. I am also a member of AIR, Region 9 Advisory Board. I've also guest blogged for the National Association of Secondary School Principals, NASSP. I've held various positions within the system of education, including teaching at the high school, community college, and university levels. I've been a cultural competence professional developer. I've been an educational policy analyst, which included working with entities such as West Ed Education and the Council of Chief State School Officers, CCSSO. I hold a PhD in teaching and learning, a master's degree or certification in educational leadership, a master's degree in English, and a bachelor's of education in English and communication. I am also the proud mother of 3 wonderful sons who are 25, 22, and 20. For today's topic, I want to talk about the importance of investing in human capital. I know that sounds like a weighty topic. People who know me well know that I'm a self-described nerd. I like books. I have books everywhere. But I really, after lots of thinking and lots of soul searching about this, I really wanted to bring up a topic that I think is near and dear to my heart and will help you to understand kind of where I'm going on this journey, and hopefully you'll come with me. I want to first start talking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. As educators, we know this to be the foundation of motivational theory. We have been taught that it's a hierarchy. Basically, if you don't have your biological and physiological needs met, then you can't really feel safe. If you can't feel safe, then you don't have a sense of belonging and love. And if you don't have that, then you don't have self-esteem. I took a class this summer with Professor Robert Stenrod through Drake University on trauma-informed restorative schools, and it transformed my life, literally. It's not that I haven't understood trauma-informed care. I know about ACEs. Those are adverse childhood experiences. I've had a lot of exposure to these things and a lot of professional development around these things. But what that course did to me was give me more insight into how these things have impacted me, and also helped me to unlock some really fundamentally important aspects that I want to share with you. So really, what it comes down to when we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we have to understand that our having needs, that belonging, that safety, that esteem, and those physiological and biological needs are all need to be in balance in order to reach our being needs, which are that self actualization. That to me is really the underlying goal of education, is to help people and citizens get to that point. And what we're experiencing now is a lot of stress and a lot of exposure of how that's not necessarily having taking place. I want to go to a researcher, Eric Fromm. He wrote a book called To Have and to Be. Quote from that book is, by being or having, I do not refer to certain separate qualities of a subject as illustrated in such statements as, I have a car, I am white, I am happy. I refer to two fundamental modes of existence, to two different kinds of orientations towards the self and the world, to two different kinds of character structure, and the respective predominance of which determines the totality of a person's thinking, feeling, and acting. Wow, that's a lot. So let me break that down for you. Basically, what he's saying is these aren't two separate things. That's what I was talking about in the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But these are encompassing ways of how we interact and how we understand our world and how we then respond to it, and whether or not we are geared oriented towards that self actualization or just meeting those basic needs determines how we interact with the world, how we see it, how we view it, how we experience our stress, how we then internalize our traumas, and how we then reflect them back to the world. For me specifically, it just so happens that when I was taking that class this summer, I also went home to spend some time with a dear friend of mine. Um, and during that trip, we uh, concluded that I should come home. Um, just long story short, he's the love of my life. And having that love in my life with all of the other things, the sense of purpose, the physiological and biological needs, all of those, this, like I'm safe. Having that last piece of the puzzle, that love, really opened up a whole new world for me. It allowed me to see myself in a different perspective and see that though I had a job that I really very much valued and like, it wasn't exactly all that I wanted and all that I could be. And so at that moment, when I came back in July, I started making steps towards this podcast, my new business, and those things that are really filling my cup, as I really hope to help others fill their cups, because we need to invest in each other. We need to stand side by side together and help each other to reach our best selves and our ultimate selves. To another theory, or another part of Maslow's work, is early childhood presuppositions. This was a foundation in Dr. Simrod's class, where we talked about these early childhood constructions of the world. One is the world is benevolent, uh, unconscious innocence. That means that we feel at an early age that we are going to have our having and being met needs met. When we don't have those met, that's when that fight or flight, fawn, freeze we start to develop those tendencies and those responses to the world when those needs aren't met. So when we feel that the world is hostile, it's not safe, um, people are out to get us, that's how we start to really develop those responses of fear, fight, flight, fawn, which is freeze, um, and um, and start to really internalize that message. Another of the presuppositions is the life in the world is meaningful. I think this really speaks to me because I've always deeply felt that I had a purpose. I never figured out what it was, couldn't figure out what it was. I feel like I'm on that track now, but that was one of the presuppositions where I early on, the messages I got, the interactions I had taught me that life is meaningful. We're all here for a purpose. We all have a role to play, and by and large, that is to enhance ourselves as well as others around us. If we don't have those needs met, that somehow we're at fault or the world is at fault. Someone in our world is at fault for us not having what we need. And the last presupposition is the self is worthy. Uh, that is where we deserve to have our having and being needs met, where we deserve to have that recognition and our true skills and talents are recognized. If those aren't met, we uh, we feel that bad things happen to people because they are bad and unworthy, and that those are permanent rather than temporary states. It's like an episode I just saw on TV where a gentleman thought that he was cursed, and so everything that happened in his life and had gotten him into the hospital felt that he was cursed. But in and going into the hospital, they learned and were able to find cancer, and they wanted to operate on it, remove it so that he wouldn't have any issues and have a long life. His notion was, if you operate on me, something else is going to happen, and it's I'm going to be worse off. But what the psychologist then worked with him on was, yeah, let's work on that curse. Let's really change your thinking about what it is that you're experiencing, and let's lift that curse. She did it in a way that was um, really giving voice to his fears and his anxieties, and then empowering him to lift the curse. And so he then had the surgery and nothing went wrong, and the cancer was removed and his prognosis was good. So those are the ways that these presuppositions with our the Maslow's hierarchy of needs really prime the pump for how we interact in the world. Every day I wake up and I see more and more tweets from educators across the country saying that they're really looking at getting out of education. I know that I talk to parents, or I have talked to parents who are concerned about the state of their education. Are their students really getting what they need from the educational system? And right now there is a lot of stress on the on the system, on the people, around what it means to educate students. I found this quote: stress makes you believe that everything needs to happen right now. So besides having those physiological and biological responses, we then want to kick into overdrive and do everything now perfectly and well, when really that's us trying to compensate for that feeling. What the rest of the quote says is, faith assures you that everything will happen at the right and perfect time. Now, I really firmly believe that that is true. I think that our system of accountability in education, though it has really helped to amp and um, document the historic disproportionality and disparities that have plagued our educational system. I do think that in the last 20 to 30 years, since I've been a professional educator, it has also increased demands and created less time and allowed for less energy and allowed for less recuperation for teachers themselves and everyone who's participating in that educational process. In addition to that, there's been fewer uh, resources and more needs. Our children are coming into our systems with just greater and greater needs, whether they're in a rural situation or an urban situation or a suburban situation. Our children are very, very different. And that's not a negative thing. It's a reality. We're also dealing with a public opinion and public involvement and a complex system that really is trying to um, shape it, change it, bend it, um, in some regards to the overall public or the overall political climate, in some regards to really fight for less disproportionality and less disparate impact on kids of color and poor and students with disabilities and English language learners, because we know that if we can get those students who have been typically marginalized into the center, the whole system works better. But that also means that the system has to be prepared for those things. And so, right now in education, it feels like there's a lot of fear and uncertainty, a lot of distrust for those who serve. And not only that, we also have three different generations of educators in the system. The folks who are my kids' age, they're looking at it from a very different lens than say I am looking at it, and then say some teachers who have been teaching already for 20 or 30 years are looking at it. Because of our experiences have been completely different. The world has changed in the last 20 to 30 years. We have more information about neuroscience, we have more information about psychology, we're more interconnected, we have more access to all kinds of things that we just didn't have before. And so that makes it also difficult to fit those pieces together so that we're working in a synergy together in the same direction, because each of those generations is coming from a different perspective. I want to introduce this notion of a mono-mind point of view. Dr. Richard Swartz talks about this mono-mind as the notion that our society has convinced us that it's normal to have one unifying identity that is the same in all situations. I am who I am, and that means I'm that person in every situation. Instead, he argues, we have different parts, burdens, if you will, that we've learned very early on in order to address the needs before us. He has a quote, and I'm going to make my little slide that I'm using a little bit bigger so that I can see it. The mono-mind paradigm has caused us to fear our parts and to view them as pathological. In attempts to control what we consider to be disturbing thoughts and emotions, we just end up fighting, ignoring, disciplining, hiding, or feeling ashamed of those impulses that keep us from doing what we want to do with our lives. When we embrace our parts, we begin to understand them as protectors who are simply trying to keep us safe and are reacting to and containing other parts that carry emotions and memories from past traumas that we have locked away inside. Again, we are living during a time where from that class I took, from a lot of the readings and a lot of I watch the news every day. our whole world is having this mass response to trauma that is, all behavior has a purpose, it has a meaning, and we are experiencing this on a global scale, through from um, climate change to the pandemic to the scarcity, the feeling of the scarcity of resources. These feelings, these notions are all stress responses to our inability to connect those parts, to connect with each other, to really hold each other as a collective and be able to be our full selves, and to go from having to being fully self-actualized, to being fully capable of 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 changing ourselves and changing our world. So how does this connect to education, you might ask? Besides, um, some of the obvious things that I've already talked about. Education is the cultivation of wisdom and virtue. That's when I think about how our founding fathers, who didn't have the same kind of access to information, whose life's experiences were much more limited than ours are today. I think about, well, how did these men, and some folks would probably criticize me a little bit because they're quote dead white men, but they are the founding fathers of our country. So, how did these men create such an enduring and lasting legacy? Well, a part of it was they shared the view of their educational experiences were geared around creating wisdom and virtue. What do we learn from the past? How do we learn from the past? How do we create a more perfect union, if you will? And how do we do that? Understanding how governments work, understanding how people work, understanding how there has to be balance. There has to be a collective that subscribe to the same notions, that that we are forming that collective identity and participating in that process willingly, openly, even when we don't necessarily agree, we are still participating in that process. Well, that looks different in 2000 or in 2022. In our 21st century, our education is connected. Not only are students learning facts and figures and information, but they're connecting that information, that knowledge to the community. They're connecting it to their lives. They're connecting it to their families. They're connecting it to things that they're experiencing in real time. With the pandemic has pushed a lot more of education into the digital sphere, using Zoom, using Skype, using all kinds of different platforms to connect, to disseminate, to share, to co-construct information and projects and such. And all of that is contextually situated, meaning that it's not for the sake of you need to do these problems because you need to do these problems, but it's you need to do these problems so you understand what that mathematical principle is, or you understand how to conceptualize your problem and then work to scale it up to a more uh, not global, but outside of yourself, to first your community, first your state, first your, however that project starts, then you have to learn how to scale it up and down. And again, uh, like much of education has always been socialization. I think what I feel is really missing is we are not helping students and ourselves to go from those parts, we go from responses to those traumas and those stressors in these very protective ways to a whole unified person who's trying to reach that self-actualization, trying to be their best selves. That is social. That part of that comes from socialization. When I was a building principal, I talked a lot about communities of practice as being both a driver for how we educate ourselves as professionals and how we lean to each other's strengths and weaknesses, or strengths as professionals to bolster or help us with our weaknesses. We all have talents and skills and dispositions that are unique to us that we can share with one another, that can help someone else compensate in an area that they're not as strong. But we can only do that if we agree to become a part of that community, to form that community, to then move forward with that community. And last but not least, but 21st century education needs to help students with the ability to discern the micro and the macro details, the small and the large. It's not one or the other. It's both. We need to be able to help students move back and forth, to be agile and adaptive, because who knows what will happen in the next 20 years. I certainly couldn't have, when I go back in my experience of things like just watching cartoons from the 80s, superhero cartoons, and how the areas where they went to um, the Justice League, I guess is what I'm thinking of, in how the Justice League, action room had all of these devices, and now we have those same kind of devices in our homes and in our hands. The Who would have known in the 80s that that would become a reality in the early 2000s for everyone, or for most people? So who knows what the next 20 years will hold for all of us? So how do we get there? I fundamentally believe that education has to be centered on love. It is a service. It is a way of um, reaching out to others. I'm often reminded of a book I read early in my grad school days called Other People's Children by Lisa Delpit. And she talks about how as parents, we definitely will fight for our kids. We will do whatever we have to do in order to make sure that our kids get what we feel they deserve. But in terms of as educators, we often think of, well, we don't often, excuse me, but as educators, we're dealing with other people's children. Now, the disconnect is we're not necessarily looking at them through the same lens that we look at our own children. I'll give you a case in point. So all three of my sons had the same teacher for algebra. The teacher taught algebra in 8th grade, and as an educator, and as a person who really wanted my kids to have access to STEM related fields, I understood that taking algebra at 8th grade was an important step, so that they could get to calculus by the time they graduated high school. So they all had this one teacher, and the teacher's name shall, I hope he's retired by now, but I will not name that teacher. And the problem was that teacher's approach to math, particularly to algebra at the 8th grade, was that you have to be gifted and talented in order to be in that class. So the way he approached his teaching was he gave an assessment on the first day. And I remember the first time I went to back to school night, and he said, I can tell from that first day assessment who's going to struggle in this class and who's not going to struggle in this class. We would now call that, from a psychological term, confirmation bias, because he used that information as a way to then discern all of the deficits those students had not necessarily the assets they brought. And if they had too many deficits, then of course they failed the class. Of course they had issues. Part of um, part of his feeling of accountability was he needed to hold his tests. He would not let students take those tests home. He needed to keep the tests so that he could maintain test integrity. And which made, when my oldest son had that class, because he had skipped an entire year in math, for me to get him into that class, it meant that, yeah, he absolutely did have some gaps in his learning, but it meant when we worked with tutors, they didn't have all the information they needed. They had gaps in their understanding of what the teacher was intending students to learn, and how the teacher was instructing that. And the only way to get hold of any of those tests was to come in the 30 minutes before or after school, in order to meet with him, and to review the test. You could only do it in his classroom, and you can only do it before and after school. As a working mother, that was really difficult. And the times that I tried to connect with him, he was not there in the building at those times exactly. So, those were a lot of barriers that, like, not institutional, but those were a lot of barriers that were put in place because he wasn't necessarily thinking of it as, how would I want my child served in this system? How would I think it would be best for them to get what they need in that situation? And as a result, my oldest son struggled with math all the way through high school. He didn't take calculus. Fortunately, he has always been a teacher of my youngest two. So everything he's always learned, he has tried to impart to his brothers. And as a result, his brothers had an easier time of it. And both of them took calculus, there's before they graduated, and one of them is an engineer now. The other one is looking at comp sci. So there are connections to those things that have lifelong impacts. I feel that we need to infuse a higher degree of teaching and learning about neuroscience and psychology in our educational programs. Educators are first and foremost people shapers and developers and caretakers. And when we put that content, when we give them that information and that understanding, we give them a way to contextualize their content and contextualize their pedagogical approaches in humanistic ways that serve the needs of the students in front of them, not just the theoretical part, but the actual serving the student and their needs. And I guess, and last, we need to invest. We need to invest in public education, invest in teachers. Teachers and administrators are exhausted. There isn't enough time in the day to do the work that they're doing, to deal with the multitude of issues, from behavior to grading um, to hybrid learning, to all of the things that they're having to juggle on top of having a family and having a life of their own. So we need to invest in these folks because they are really, really doing the work of building our society one child at a time. And the other multitude of people it takes to make a school, the counselors, the people who work in food service, the engagement specialists, the para educators, the list goes on and on and on. It takes a village to educate our children, just like it takes a village to educate to raise a child. One of the reasons why I have stayed in Iowa so long is because there is a village for children here. When I moved here, I understood that this is a child-focused place where my kids were free to go out and play. We were free that we had a safe environment to go trick-or-treating. They had lots of opportunities and lots of resources for exploring different things like music and art and science and business, and there's so much here that they have access to, that it's easy access to. It's not super hard to get involved. The hardest thing is knowing how to, if you're not in that system, if you're not being served in a way that gives you that information, and helps you with the to navigate those arenas. That's what I think makes Iowa such a special place, and we need to do that everywhere. I have been talking for a long time. People who know me well know that I really am not a long talker. I am driven to this work because I see a lot of the gaps uh, in education. It's it's part of it's become part of uh, the larger conversation in our country that is a little bit polarized, um, and I really think it's foundational to who we are as Americans to educate all of our students, to educate all of our children, and to make sure that our children have the best outcomes. I firmly believe that is what we've intended in our compulsory educational system, and I want to be a part of that process to help us get there. I'll start to wrap up with a quote, another quote. It actually comes from Mariana Williamson. It's a poem that came out of her book, Return to Love, Reflections on the Principles of A Course in Miracles. And it is, this is not the full poem that is usually attributed to it, but I think you'll understand when I finish. Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, and fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? Your playing small does not serve the world. We are all meant to shine as children do. And as we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give others permission to do the same. That really is the center of this podcast, is to really help us all shine, to be our brilliant and gorgeous and talented and fabulous selves, so that we can create the communities of practice, and we can create the situations that help our students and our communities and their parents and their families to do the same things, and to be able to reach their best selves. In closing, thank you for tuning into this first episode of Uncommon Voices, Uncommon Visions. My name is Dr. Valerie Nyberg. I'm your host. Please feel free to follow me on Twitter at VN Nyberg, NYBERG. Instagram handle is the same. And check me out, check my business out, Liminal Education Consultants. You can find me online. I do equity, trauma-informed care, restorative circles. I also share my personal story about surviving and thriving in adverse circumstances, and would love to talk to students, staff, whomever who needs to hear this message. Thank you so much. And please check out my episode 2, which will drop in 2 weeks, with Laura Gray, administrator at Iowa City Community School District. She is the founder of Restorative Community Partners, and she also has a podcast called Restorative Equity. Check her out. She'll be with us in 2 weeks to sit down and have a conversation. Thank you so much for your time and your energy. Have a blessed day.